truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Thursday, August 29th, 2024, the 1,317th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month, and in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on a wide variety of podcast platforms and, of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so we're going to talk today a little bit about Telegram and social media censorship and how these issues intersect with how the world at large is run. The primary topic of conversation on Tucker Carlson's recent interview with Mike Benz, talking about Telegram and the detaining on Sunday in France of Telegram co-founder Pavel Durov, ostensibly for his quote-unquote complicity in a whole range of alleged crimes that were said to be in some way facilitated by the Telegram app. Pavel Durov is being accused of complicity in crimes other people committed because they allegedly were using Telegram for some aspect of communications around those crimes. Now, to the extent that any of this is real and true as reported, it is obviously the sort of case that could only be pursued by an authoritarian government, horrified that any outlet for free speech would provide the people a way to figure out what's going on and then overthrow that government for all its illegitimacy. Mark Zuckerberg of Meta Facebook the other day just came out and admitted that his platform was knowingly involved in the censorship of the American people at the request of the illegitimate uniparty government and the deep state agencies in and around Washington, the NGOs that spawn off of that, in order to preserve the official story within the central narrative about COVID that led countless people to having their accounts banned. They lost their information, their contacts, their pictures, and whatever sense of community they developed there. They lost the availability of all those features for their business. A lot of people use Facebook to run their businesses. They made normal people who were trying to discover the truth and then tell other people about it look like deceivers and frauds. They destroyed reputations. They destroyed relationships. And those are just the social factors. They protected a false story about a pandemic. They created the division. They stoked the hate movement. They made it difficult for people to access critical medical information in order to protect themselves. And then they convinced people to participate in a dangerous medical experiment. Who knows how much death was caused by censorship on social media, with Facebook leading that charge? And of course, that wasn't it. It wasn't just COVID. They also helped to censor the Hunter Biden laptop story, going along with the idea that somehow that was Russian disinformation, even though the authors of the 51 former intelligence officials letter in that letter said they didn't actually know. And of course, they gave the exact same treatment to every other major regime psyop over the last however many years. It's at least 4. The fake election, the very violent insurrection, the vaccine mandates, of course, the reporting on the conflict in Ukraine, the paragliding go-kart incident, and everything that has happened since then. They've completely manipulated the public conversation and therefore totally distorted the body of knowledge within the collective mind. They have helped to build and protect the false reality. And they did that at the behest of the uniparty government apparatus. The uniparty operating, of course, on behalf of the global regime. And in contrast to that, you've got Pavel Durov, who runs Telegram and is in trouble because he won't go along with enough of what the regime demands. And so he was detained on Sunday in France. I said on Monday when we discussed this, I think he was probably going to be released on Wednesday. There were hints that that was true. That was French policy. And indeed, that's happened. This is the New York Post from yesterday. Telegram founder Pavel Durov released from police custody to face questioning after arrest in France. Telegram founder Pavel Durov was released from police custody in France on Wednesday and transferred to court for questioning before a possible indictment. Durov, the Russian-born billionaire who was arrested over the weekend, left the anti-fraud office near Paris in what looked like a police vehicle on Wednesday afternoon, according to CNN. French prosecutors said the 39-year-old tech tycoon, who was in police custody for 96 hours, the maximum allowed under French law, was being transferred to a Paris court to face initial questioning and possible indictment. The judge will decide whether to place him under formal investigation following his arrest as part of a probe into organized crime on the messaging app, a judicial source told Reuters. Let's skip down further in the article. It notes the judge must also decide whether to keep him in pretrial detention. One factor they will consider is whether Durov is a flight risk. He holds French and United Arab Emirates citizenship and a net worth estimated at more than $9 billion. The news outlet Politico reported that French authorities had also issued an arrest warrant for Durov's brother Nikolai, the co-founder of Telegram, and that both warrants had been issued in March. And that's interesting because The reporting on Sunday and Monday suggested that the French had just begun their investigation on July 9th. Asked about the report, the Paris prosecutor's office said arrest warrants were covered by the secrecy of the investigation. It said the only person currently being questioned was Pavel Durov. Now, many people online have been joking that the French actually got the wrong guy, because if they were trying to break Telegram's encryption, they would actually need to get to Pavel's brother Nikolai. But Nikolai is not in France. Nikolai is reportedly in Russia. And it's hard to imagine Vladimir Putin choosing to hand him over to the French, and you'll see why by the end of this episode. Nikolai is a mathematician and programmer. He is credited with being the lead developer of the Durov's first platform, VK, which is basically the Russian version of Facebook, whereas Telegram is the Russian version of WhatsApp. How does it happen? He also developed Telegram, of course, and he's believed to be the author of the white paper for the TON cryptocurrency, which is Telegram's internal currency, the Telegram Open Network cryptocurrency. Now, we're going to spend a bunch of time on Tucker Carlson interviews today, primarily the one with Mike Benz, but Tucker Carlson also interviewed Pavel Durov just a few months back, and Durov talked about his brother Nikolai in that interview.
It'll be a long story.
That's okay.
I was born in 1984 in the Soviet Union, so it was a fun year to be born in. And back then, I could witness, the deficiencies of the centralized system we had in the Soviet Union. When I was 4 years old, my family moved to Italy, where I could compare what I saw in Turin, Italy, with what I experienced in the Soviet Union. And I thought the capitalist system, the free market system, is definitely better, at least for me. And I went to school in Italy. I became sort of a part of the European as a result. But then when the Soviet Union collapsed, we decided to move back to Russia. In Italy, though, me and my brother, we had a lot of fun time. He was shown live on Italian TV as a young prodigy kid who could solve cubic equations in real time, being just 10 years old. And that was considered to be impossible back then in Italy.
I don't know what a cubic equation is, so yeah, it sounds difficult.
Skipping ahead a bit.
Different, and I still enjoyed it, because in Russia in the 90s, you had these experimental schools where you were taught everything. Like we had 6 foreign languages. We had math, like very specialized.
6 foreign languages at once?
6 foreign languages in parallel. You would have math similar that you would have in specialized math schools, and like chemistry at the same level you would have at schools specialized in chemistry and biology. So that was really intense. My brother, he became world champion in maths, in the international Olympiads in maths and programming many times in a row, absolute best. Myself, I was just the best student at my school. Also did some victories in local competitions in several areas, but we both were very passionate about coding and designing stuff. And because we brought this IBM PC XT computer from Italy back in the early 90s, we were one of the few families in Russia who could actually teach ourselves how to program.
And there's one more clip, but did you just hear him describe the education in Russia in the 90s? Were we told about that? Was our education that good? I went to a rural public school, so my education was not that good. And I know a bunch of people who went to private schools and their education was not that good, but somehow Russia's was. Weird.
The idea for Telegram came when we were still based in Russia, because at some point we had this very stressful situation where armed policemen would come to my house, try to break in, because I refused to take down these opposition groups that I mentioned earlier. And I realized there is no secure means of communication. I realized I want to tell my brother what's going on, to coordinate whatever we want to do. And every tool to communicate I could use was not really secure, not encrypted. It was not safe to use them. So I thought, it could be a good idea to actually come up with a decently encrypted messaging app. And my brother, being the genius that he is, he was able to create this encryption standard that we're using up until this day with minor changes. But the idea came.
Your brother wrote the encryption?
Yes. Well, my brother had like 2 PhDs in maths, super smart. He could, he's an expert in cryptography. He designed the basic principles of the Telegram's encryption. I was more on the user interface side, the way how the app works, the features, etc. He was responsible for the encryption side.
So Pavel Durov makes it quite clear that his brother is the genius behind the encryption. And by the way, that's a very good interview. Pavel Durov is clearly a key player in the information war. And so if that's your thing, I encourage you to listen to it. It would seem just from those remarks alone that the people speculating about the goal being the encryption keys and that they ended up arresting the wrong Durov might be on to something. But let's continue. This is TechCrunch from October 27th, 2013. So this is 11 years ago. Meet Telegram, a secure messaging app from the founders of VK, Russia's largest social media network. And I encourage you all to check out VK. It really does look like a Facebook clone. And I've discussed this a few times before, certainly in the TikTok-related episodes from March of this year. We have the social media apps developed by the regime and organizations like DARPA, and then all of them essentially have a clone out there in the world that is not controlled by the regime. You have Facebook and VK in this example, WhatsApp and Telegram. TikTok is basically the clone of Snapchat, or probably was at some point. We have plenty of apps, Rumble in particular, looking to be YouTube's main competitor as a video platform. And there are quite a few looking to be the chief competitor to Twitter in the short messaging space. And as I discussed earlier this week, most of that is probably mute as social media decentralizes. And I should also note that Gab in America is kind of a Facebook clone too. It just really has never reached a critical mass for whatever reason. And hey, maybe that's our fault for not supporting it. But let's go to TechCrunch and remember this is 2013. Created by the founders of Russia's biggest social networking platform, Telegram, is a new messaging app that offers speed, security, and features such as secret chats with end-to-end encryption and self-destructing messages. Brothers Nikolai and Pavel Durov, who launched VK in 2006, began working on Telegram 18 months ago as a research project because they wanted to create something that was, quote, really secure and fun at the same time, end quote. The importance of Telegram was underscored when Edward Snowden's revelations about NSA and PRISM were first made public in June. It made a lot of people really scared and concerned about the current situation. We are certainly among many, many people who started to think about ways to fix the problem, Pavel told me in a phone interview. And it's interesting that VK launched in 2006 because it turns out that despite Facebook being founded in 2004, it really only launched as a public platform in 2006. The timing is amazing, isn't it? Further down in the TechCrunch article, Telegram is based on a custom data protocol called MT-Proto, built by Nikolai Durov, a mathematician. The app's secret chats, a separate feature from its ordinary chats, use end-to-end encryption. They cannot be forwarded and can be set to self-destruct after a certain amount of time. One key difference between Telegram's secret chat and ordinary chats is that secret chats are not stored in the app's cloud, which means you can only access messages from the device of origin. Telegram wants to earn users' trust by operating as a non-profit open platform initiative. The first thing that we wanted to make clear is that nobody has to trust anybody. We don't take people's trust for Telegram for granted, says Pavel Durov. Skipping ahead once again. Telegram's founders say the app will remain non-profit because that enables them to avoid commercial and legal pressure. If they eventually need funds to scale up, Telegram will ask for donations from users or make additional services available as in-app purchases. These could include a virtual number that can be used instead of a real mobile number, ensuring more confidentiality. Nikolai Durov oversaw the scaling up of VK's platform as it grew to over 50 million daily unique users over 7 years. Pavel says the lessons the brothers learned during VK's development means they will be able to make sure Telegram remains secure even if its user base rapidly expands. And we will skip ahead to the last few paragraphs. Another lesson Telegram's team learned from its experience with VK is to stay clear of Russia's government. The app rents data centers and servers around the world, including in London, San Francisco, Singapore, and Helsinki. As a foreign company and offshore entity, we will not be obliged to comply with the rules of Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and countries like that, says Durov. So this is something they've been thinking about for a long time. If Telegram received requests from government or legal organizations, it would not be able to provide data for end-to-end encrypted chats anyway, because the encryption keys are generated on each user's device and not the server. Anyone could look into our documentation and the source code of the app and make sure that we are not trying to fool anyone. The NSA, for that matter, could do the same thing and see that we cannot provide them with any data for purely algorithmic, mathematical reasons, he adds. I think that is a way to refuse data requests without openly breaking local rules in America or any other country. Telegram is the first project by Digital Fortress, a new company founded by the Durov brothers. The next project will involve voice communication, though Durov is still not sure if it will be developed as a separate project or as a new feature for Telegram. Current priorities for Telegram's small engineering team include enabling users to permanently delete accounts. We will come up with solutions to really ensure people of the complete deletion of their data, says Durov. We have to consider several options and choose the best one to do that in a transparent way. So it sounds like their philosophy has been very consistent now for nearly 20 years, which is not to say there's never been any government influence. In fact, I think that, as with all the popular legacy social media apps in America, VK and Telegram were probably started as some sort of military project. They seem to be the same technology and framework as their American clones, Facebook VK, WhatsApp, Telegram. Now, at some point, they obviously diverged. They are clearly different apps now, but a lot of the functionality and the feel is very similar. Strangely, Facebook acquired WhatsApp only 4 months after this article was written. So at some point, you kind of got to wonder, did Facebook and WhatsApp rip off VK and Telegram? Or alternatively, perhaps the same entity that controlled all that technology chose a Russian version with a Russian face and an American version with an American face. Amazing, isn't it, that Durov and Zuckerberg both appear in major news stories at the same time? How does it happen? Now, if you've followed this show or followed me on social media over the course of the last 3.5 to 4 years, you've probably heard me say before that Telegram is my favorite social media app. I think it is by far the best social media technology available. As I mentioned the other day, of course, it has bot and spam issues, and those are very unfortunate. They definitely harm the user experience. It probably discourages new users from spending a lot of time there, but its functionality and its speed are unmatched. It can actually function as all of the legacy social media apps combined in one place. That probably works better than all of them and is not censored. At least as far as I can tell, there might be some back-end manipulation. A lot of people suspect that there is. The follower numbers on channels and how they kind of stay the same basically forever suggest that there might be some level of manipulation. But again, we're in an information war. It's not always the people in charge of the platforms who are responsible for the problems on those platforms. And that's funny because the French have detained Pavel Durov for exactly that, blaming him for problems on the platform, but not even problems that he could be responsible for, just crimes that other people commit while also using Telegram. CNN published an article on Tuesday about the Russian response to the detainment of Pavel Durov. The headline, Kremlin tries to calm fears over security of Telegram after arrest of founder Durov in France. And with that headline, they just suggest that there was an oh no reaction, but I'm really not sure there was any oh no reaction. The Kremlin is trying to calm fears that the arrest of Telegram founder Pavel Durov in France could upend the messaging platform, which is extremely popular in Russia and plays a key role in coordinating the war effort in Ukraine. Oh, okay. Russian government spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters on Tuesday that calls for users to delete their sensitive messages on the app, including from the editor of Russia's state-run RT News, were, quote-unquote, utterly stupid. Peskov added that though the allegations against Durov, who was born in Russia but also has citizenship in France and the UAE, were serious, French authorities would have to put forward equally serious evidence to back them up. Otherwise, he says, there will be a direct attempt to restrict freedom of communication, and we can even say direct intimidation of the head of a large company, which means there will be politics involved, something that Mr. Macron denied yesterday. The Kremlin's move to assuage concerns over the future safety of Telegram underscores just how important the app has become to Russia's military. And again, we're not going to go through the entire article. We'll skip around a bit. At a news conference in Moscow, following talks with his Yemeni counterpart on Tuesday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov alleged, without proof, that, quote, Durov was clearly taken on someone's advice and is being threatened with terrible punishment, apparently hoping somehow to gain access to encryption codes. Describing Telegram, Durov also said, it is very convenient. It is very secure. You really have to love how they just throw without proof in there, as if the Russian foreign minister is less informed about the situation than CNN's reporters. We are in such a weird information world that some degenerate know-nothing and normie who churns out articles for CNN requires proof from the Russian foreign ministry that there was something untoward behind some trumped-up charges to justify the detainment of a tech CEO who runs a free speech platform used by the Russian military. Oh, yeah, totally. It was because he was complicit in crimes other people did that he had no knowledge about. And just a bit more of this article. Those same features have also made Telegram a key communication tool for the Russian military and pro-Kremlin bloggers. One popular pro-Russian war blogger with more than 780,000 followers reshared a post saying that France's decision to arrest Durov meant that, quote, in essence, the head of communications for the Russian armed forces was detained, end quote. And that sounds like it's probably going a little overboard unless there's something we don't know about Pavel Durov. Another less followed military blogger posted a picture with the words "for Pavel" on a missile presumably bound for Ukraine, which on Monday was hit by the largest aerial attack since the war began. Oh, I wonder if those issues might be related. Did they detain Durov the day before that happened? What a well-crafted story. The blogger, Alexei Sukhonkin, said that Telegram is, quote, the basis of military communications, end quote, even if Russian government officials publicly dispute the claim. Telegram is a powerful alternative to the official and, of course, more efficient information resource. Telegram is also the main civilian messenger in Russia, practically uncontrolled by Western intelligence agencies, as well as a powerful advertising resource and a platform for personal blogs. All this is under threat, according to Sukhonkin. Telegram's popularity with pro-Russian military bloggers and the Kremlin's active support for Durov is somewhat surprising considering the tech entrepreneur refused to supply Moscow with data from users of his previous enterprise, a Facebook-like social media network called VK. Durov later resigned as VK's CEO and sold his shares for millions of dollars. Both he and Telegram are now based in Dubai. All right, so let's get into some highlights from this interview Tucker Carlson has now done with Mike Benz. That was released yesterday on the Tucker Carlson network. You can find it on any podcast app. You can find it on YouTube. Go ahead and listen to the whole thing. It's about 2 hours long. Extremely interesting. Mike Benz has extensive knowledge on many of the subjects we've covered on this podcast over the last 4 years. And he has extensive knowledge on the U.S. State Department, our intelligence communities, the influence the global regime wields around the world through its uniparty proxies in the United States and the deep state, and the more technical side of the information war. And so we'll get to a bunch of that, but he also gets into color revolutions really quickly in the first few minutes. And he talks about the author of the Color Revolution playbooks, Norm Eisen, also the man who authored the fake Trump indictments. And he mentioned specifically the country of Belarus and the attempt just 4 years ago last week to overthrow the Lukashenko government and attempt to convince the world that some fairly attractive middle-aged lady and intel construct had actually defeated Lukashenko in that election despite achieving only 10% of the vote. This being Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Afterwards, she fled the country, and she has since been convicted of treason. She was going to be the global regime puppet installed in Belarus if only they could pull it off. And they try these same things in countries all across the world. It has actually worked here before. They did it with Barack Obama, and they're trying to do it with Kamala Harris, having smuggled her in on the back of Joe Biden. And that's exactly the same program they were just attempting to use against Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. Tikhanovskaya was the wife of a popular YouTuber in Belarus. It's almost the exact same situation as Alexei Navalny and his wife, Yulia Navalnaya, in Russia. Alexei's been taken off the board, and now Yulia is being elevated, even though neither of them represent any real opposition to Vladimir Putin. They've had a much easier time with these sorts of operations in places like Finland with Sanna Marin and New Zealand with Jacinda Ardern. It's just part of the program, and they were attempting to run that program in Belarus in 2020. Here is Mike Benz.
We're not getting the answer from the Congress, who should be getting it for us, which is to say that an entity like the House Foreign Affairs Committee, if it was committed to free speech, would be interrogating whether or not there was a U.S. embassy back channel to French law enforcement or French intelligence or the French government in terms of doing this, because this is a pattern of practice that the U.S. embassy has pursued all over the world, and particularly in Europe, through branding like anti-corruption or whatnot. This is something, even dating back to Norm Eisen when he was the ambassador to the Czech Republic, championing these sort of anti-corruption reforms from the Czech government to arrest the politicians who essentially opposed the State Department agenda there. This is very common. If you go to places like the Journal of Democracy, which is the academic journal for the National Endowment for Democracy, which is probably the most notorious CIA cutout in the whole arsenal, they have whole academic journals on how to push the Poland government to arrest the politicians from the PIS party, from the Law and Order party, especially in the judicial system. And
to arrest them?
Yes, to mass arrest. We have a concept in American statecraft called transitional justice, which is this idea that essentially after the U.S. overthrows a country, we arrest all of the opposition politicians, opposition judges, opposition journalists, propaganda spreaders, in order to stop the reemergence of threats to democracy. No, I'm not joking.
You make it a one-party state so it can be a democracy.
Right. Well, is this China pushing this, or the United? Just to be clear, or the United States? This is the United States. And we do that to stabilize the democratic institutions and effectively make it cheaper for the United States to manage, because you don't need to manage the constant recurring threat of the party you just vanquished. So this is something that the U.S. State Department was spearheading years before Trump got into office. And it was so effective that these same cast of characters are back for Trump. Norm Eisen was the one who spearheaded, the impeachment. He drafted articles of impeachment before Trump was even took the oath of office, and also led the elements of the 2019 Ukraine impeachment, the lawfare that's currently being done with the 90 plus felonies against Trump. So this is a instrument of statecraft, the use of prosecutions in order to bring leverage against and to get rid of pesky people who oppose the State Department's priorities. But in the specific case of Telegram, there's a lot going on here.
Now, I can't imagine a scenario where Tucker Carlson doesn't already know these things, but one of the things that Tucker Carlson does really well is make himself the proxy for an audience who wouldn't be familiar with these concepts. Now, I don't really like that approach. It doesn't seem particularly honest to me. And it also provides a cover for when he's just pretending not to know something, but that's the charitable interpretation. Mike Benz is laying out stuff that we have talked about here for years. And again, Mike Benz has a long, extensive history on this. I'm not saying he discovered these things from listening to me or anything. I'm just reiterating this because we live in a very strange information space where people have a hard time believing something is true until someone that is approved by the centralizing authorities agrees with it in public on a major platform. If I scream for 3 years that Norm Eisen is the author of all these color revolution playbooks, and they're using that same playbook all over the world, and they have used essentially that same playbook cyclically over generations all across the world, well, I'm a conspiracy theorist. But if Mike Benz mentions that he's done it a few times in America, well, then it's just true. And that's how a lot of this interview feels to listen to it. We're told always that this is to wake up the normies. Let's see if it happens. Regardless, Benz knows this information inside and out, and the interview serves as an excellent 2-hour understanding of this in the big picture. So he's talking about the U.S. State Department using lawfare and information warfare and arrests and imprisonment in order to overthrow other nations. All we have to do is understand that they've done the same thing here. And it's strange because we've all witnessed them doing this. We've all experienced it, but people still have a hard time admitting that something like that could ever happen here. They think all of this is real and happening spontaneously, and that there are little problems here or there in our institutions, and that maybe if this or that were changed or fixed, that problem would go away. But that's not how it is. Benz just said the idea is that essentially after the U.S. overthrows a country, we make arrests of all the opposition politicians, opposition judges, opposition journalists, propaganda spreaders, in order to stop the reemergence of threats to democracy. You make it a one-party state. And of course, that's what we have here. Mike Benz doesn't focus on that part. He focuses primarily on tech censorship, and he actually brings the interview back to only that. It seems like he is only on Tucker Carlson to address the big tech censorship problems worldwide. He says repeatedly that his only concern is censorship on the internet. But just because that's as far as he'll go in this interview doesn't mean that we can't go further. We can understand that that same playbook has been played here, and that the goal was to create a one-party state, and that they've been successful in that goal after having done this multiple times in our country's history. The existence of the uniparty means that we are a one-party state. There is an illusion of two parties, but it's only an illusion. They pursue the same agenda together, and the regime systematically eliminates opponents of the uniparty whenever they are able to rise, which is what they've tried to do to Donald Trump and his movement and his supporters. None of this is new, and you can't just go vote your way out of it by heading on down to the local elementary school cafeteria and pressing some buttons on an iPad screen attached to a black box. People at far higher levels are making these decisions, and then it's just a matter of whether or not the people will believe them and comply. He mentions Belarus and the color revolutions there a couple more times in the interview, but we will leave that for now. Let's continue.
So the problem is, because Telegram is also an open playing field, because Pavel has not relinquished either to the United States or to Russia, it has also allowed Russian propaganda to propagate. And this is a problem right now in Ukraine. Just 2 weeks after your interview with Pavel, Radio Free Europe, which is an institution that was created by the CIA, and it was run directly, but for its first 20 years by the CIA, just 2 weeks after your interview with Pavel, called Telegram a spy in every Ukrainian's pocket, and made the argument that Ukraine needs to wrest control over Telegram, and it laid out the following reasons for doing so. It said that 75% of Ukrainians currently use Telegram, and they have been using Telegram. This is up from 20% just a few years ago. Because of Pavel's solidarity with the concept of free speech, it's been highly trusted for many years, but they're not sure if there's a Russian back channel now. And they cite several reasons around Pavel's potential financing from a bond raise several years ago that may have had Russian investors in it. They cite the fact that Russian internal documents promote the use of Telegram for its own military. The fact that over 50% of Russia itself uses Telegram. The fact that the Russian military uses it safely and has no problem with it, and the fact that there may be Russian financing of Pavel. This is the argument that they make, that perhaps it was compromised. Perhaps the reason Russia dropped its attempt to ban Telegram after the 2018 affair may have been because an agreement was secretly reached. And if that is the case, then that would essentially make all of the military operations and all of the statecraft and secret channels that Ukraine is currently using be spied on. All communications, the entire war effort. Maybe the reason Ukraine is losing is because Russia knows everything Ukraine is doing.
We hear a lot from viewers about.
And so, as you can hear, the Tucker Carlson show goes immediately to commercial after Benz finishes that segment. But he has laid out the theory that the concern over Telegram is that Russia has had a back channel for 6 years. Apparently, they just discovered this, which is extremely hard to believe. But the suggestion is then that Russia has been monitoring all of the Ukrainian military communications, and that is how they are able to dominate this war so thoroughly. They know what Ukraine is going to do before Ukraine does it. But also, Joe Biden, the fake president, handed over Five Eyes intelligence on Russia and Ukraine to the Chinese back when the whole thing started. And then the Chinese gave it over to Russia. So Russia's always had the plans. They've always had the intel. And then, of course, if you think back to early to mid 2023, you'll remember how we couldn't stop hearing about the spring counteroffensive, and then the spring-summer counteroffensive, and then the summer counteroffensive. But all of that went for naught because apparently some 21-year-old National Guardsman put all the counteroffensive planning on a Discord chat. And I got to be honest with you, after hearing Mike Benz talk about the military use by Russia of the Telegram app and the fact that Ukraine was using it too, and understanding that their communications must be done through some channel, just as our communications are done through some channel, you really have to wonder if it wasn't actually the military communications being done on Discord that were then intercepted and released, and the whole story about the National Guardsman was just a cover for something much different and something that might have done more to shake the public's belief in any competence the illegitimate Biden administration, the rest of the warmongers and the neocons in the military industrial complex and the State Department, or any aspect of the global regime might have. It's not that they're incompetent and the whole thing was doomed from the start to the extent that it's been real at all. It's that some young National Guardsman made a whoopsie. Now, this section's going to be a few minutes because I think it's important, and also I think it's the furthest Tucker Carlson has gone with admitting or discussing what the actual state of play in the United States is right now.
Since when is it okay for the people in charge of a government to ban populism? I don't understand. Like, when did we all agree that populism is bad? I thought the whole system was fundamentally a populist system. The country belongs to its citizens. I thought that was the whole deal.
Oh, I can answer that because it's basically doctrine. There's been a redefinition of democracy from meaning the consensus of individuals to meaning the consensus of institutions. And this is a very clever sleight of hand reframing trick that they played after the 2016 election in the U.S., and they were setting this up. So just to get...
They're playing with revolution here. I mean, they've lost their legitimacy. So I'm not going to try to overthrow the U.S. government. I'm 55. I'm not going to do that. But at some point, someone's going to try to do that, and it's going to be kind of hard to see why they're not justified in doing that because it's not legitimate. Their legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed. That's our system. And when they no longer have the consent of the governed, they're not legitimate, period.
So all I care about is freedom of speech on the internet.
But if you have no freedom of speech, it's not a legitimate country.
So there's a lot to get to on all of this.
And so it seems pretty clear to me that Mike Benz is not able to, or maybe just doesn't want to, discuss the legitimacy of the current government in the United States of America. We don't have freedom of speech. They are actively against populism, which means they don't care about what the majority of the actual people want. And because of those two facts alone, it means the government operates outside the will and consent of the governed. That alone is a full and complete case that the government is illegitimate. You don't need to go any further than that, and no one doubts the presence of those aspects. We are censored and our elections are stolen. There is no legitimacy in the government. To the extent that anyone follows their laws, it's only because of fear, politeness, or laziness. Again, I wish we were in a better information space, and I wish that people had the confidence and the courage to back their own beliefs, and that they wouldn't need a permission structure from the authoritative sources to say what is obviously true. But at this point now, everybody's favorite TV man has given the public a permission structure to discuss the illegitimacy of our government. This, of course, has been true for well over 3.5 years, while people like Tucker Carlson have refused to say it. Maybe if Tucker and Rogan and all of these other people were actually attesting to the illegitimacy of our system on their big platforms, rather than just spending all their time hosting intelligence assets and lying to millions of people at a time for more than $1 million a week, we might not be in this situation. But I know, they're just waking up the normies. And hey, maybe now the normies will wake up. But the real question is, do we need to wait for normies to agree with Tucker Carlson before we can say the things that we believe? And the answer, of course, is no. Everybody hopes that we can just all agree about the truth without any conflict. Someone like Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan or Ben Shapiro will wake up the normies, and at that point, the normies will stop going crazy whenever anyone else talks about these ideas. And when that happens, then we can finally share our ideas with these normies, knowing that we're not going to upset them and won't have to deal with the consequences. Thank you, Tucker Carlson, for giving everyone permission to say the things that Thomas Jefferson said 250 years ago. And oh, there was great celebrating all throughout the hills, the sounds of patriotism and groveling before Tucker Carlson. Thank you, Tucker. Now we can finally talk about the things Thomas Jefferson wrote down and we founded this country upon 250 years ago. Finally. Back to Mike Benz.
It's really cute. If you run a Boolean search on Google right now and you look at what places like the Atlantic Council and Brookings and the National Endowment for Democracy were all saying in the months after Trump's election in 2016, they were making the argument that maybe democracy was a mistake because it leads to outcomes like, before they doubled down on it, there was a brief window where they said, you know what, actually, democracy leads to outcomes like Donald Trump and Brexit. And at the time, NATO, its biggest fear was free speech on the internet. In early 2017, NATO periodicals were saying the biggest threat to NATO is not a hostile foreign attack from Russia. They would come to eat these words 5 years later. They argued conventional warfare is over. The biggest threat to NATO is free speech on the internet because it's allowing the rise of Marine Le Pen in France. It's allowing the rise of Matteo Salvini in Italy. It's allowing the rise of the Vox Party in Spain, AfD in Germany. So we would have Frexit, Grexit, Italexit, Spexit. The entire EU would come undone, which meant NATO's commercial arm comes undone, which means NATO comes undone, which means there's no enforcement arm for the IMF and the World Bank. So it would be like the ending scene from Fight Club where the credit card companies all crash down just because you're allowed to speak your mind on the internet.
This is so sick.
So they had this sort of crisis of, well, what do we do about it? Democracy is the problem. And then they said, well, the problem is our entire diplomatic toolkit. Everything that the CIA does, everything the State Department does, everything USAID does, everything that the Pentagon Civil Affairs does is all under this rubric of promoting democracy. This is how we topple foreign governments. We only have two predicates for toppling a government. One of them is aggression. The other one is repression. So if they are aggressing against a foreign country, we get to be the world's policeman. We get to topple them for their military activity. But if we can't nail them on that, we can always get them on repression. We can say they're repressing their own people, so we need to bring democracy there. And this is the lion's share of this is what we did in Belarus. This is what we did in Moscow from 2010 to 2020. This is what we did in all these other countries. And I'm not even arguing normatively about whether that's right or wrong. But you have to understand that free speech on the internet is the collateral damage of this proxy war. But here's how they rescued democracy. They said we need to stick with democracy even though we don't like its outcomes. Because it would take too long to turn the Titanic. All of our cloak and dagger, black ops, plausibly deniable toppling of governments worldwide, is all in the name of democracy. All the NGOs we fund, all the civil society activists, all the media institutions, is all democracy, democracy, democracy. So we need to simply, instead of getting rid of this concept of championing democracy, we need to redefine what democracy is. We need to make it not about the consensus of individuals, how people vote, but make it about the consensus of institutions. And we will simply define democratic institutions as anyone who supports the U.S. foreign policy establishment and its transatlantic partners in the UK.
Again, this is stuff we've been talking about for a very long time. Quote unquote, our democracy is just a collection of the global regime's institutions that are employed by the global government in order to run all of these countries around the world in ways that are similar enough that the regime will be eventually able to bring all of the countries of the world simultaneously under its control. Now, that does not seem to be working out at all. They wanted a one world international liberal rules-based order, and instead we have the emergence of the multipolar world order. And the regime, or at least regime elements, are being removed in countries all around the world, and they have nothing to say about it. They're not even able to take back their small countries. They haven't taken back Myanmar. They haven't taken back the countries of the Sahel in Africa. Nicolas Maduro hasn't been unseated in Venezuela. They're not winning the war in Ukraine. And their special secret prize in Israel, their most important proxy state, the place for which the last 125 years of conflict has been fought to first seize and then protect, is being wholly discredited on the world stage to the point where its continuation seems unlikely as far as I'm concerned, and certainly not the way the global regime wants. And in the meantime, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the state of Palestine, is writing letters to Donald Trump calling him Your Excellency and planning to join the BRICS coalition. He'll be attending their meeting this fall. Unless the global regime's agenda for the last 50 years, and truthfully much longer, has all just been an elaborate ruse to trick us and demoralize us, the failure and collapse of that agenda around the world in ways that we can see if only we choose to understand it should be the only sign you need to understand that the world is not going to end if the TV tells us that we get the hose again on November 5th. I mean, honestly, the only thing that we need to know on November 6th to react to whatever the news is our elections are incapable of yielding legitimate outcomes. And so no matter what the TV says, we need to pursue the legitimacy of our elections. Now, if you think the country would realize that truth and be more likely to pursue legitimate elections if the TV tells them Donald Trump won, then so be it. I'm happy to travel down that path. I don't think it's a very likely one. I think the country's going to get the hose again, so people realize they actually have to stand for something. But I'm more than happy to be wrong about that. Let's continue with Mike Benz.
National Science Foundation, and even the story of the internet, again, it was created by the U.S. military, and it was turned over to the National Science Foundation, and that's where the dual use comes in. When the military developed the cell phone, the military developed GPS, the military developed most of the technology at the R&D level that we now live under. In fact, the military developed all of the internet anonymity software in order to help Pentagon and CIA and State Department-backed political groups be able to orchestrate regime change. The VPNs, the Tor network, end-to-end encrypted chat, all these things were Pentagon projects before they became dual use, just like the internet became dual use. It was a military project, but then then the civilian commercial architecture was built on top of it. But the National Science Foundation has two major domestic censorship programs. And in the charter documents establishing one of them in 2021, when, in February 2021, right when the month after Biden took office, this is a $40 million program. And in the charter document, it says that the purpose is to stop misinformation about democratic institutions. And one of the democratic institutions they define is the media. So understand this. This is the Pentagon's civilian arm funding $40 million worth of censorship, exclusively censorship institutions to stop Americans from delegitimizing the media, to stop Americans from undermining trust in media. If North Korea did this, we would pass sanctions on them. If Iran did this, we would pass sanctions on them. This is because establishment media, and again, politically aligned media with the blob, has to be propped up as a buffer to drown out the voices of populists. So the strategy here is twofold: turning up the knobs of the blob's propaganda channels and turning down the knobs of anyone who opposes that. Because you can win two ways. You can win, three ways. You win in a fair fight, or you can win by supersaturating your own media voice, or you can win by default because the opposition political party, the opposition political movement is not allowed. This is why the U.S. State Department, after 2016, established in like 140 countries now these censorship programs in the name of countering disinformation, in the name of media literacy, in the name of digital resilience. They have all these branding terms for it because they perceive this El Dorado gold mine of a new method for total political control over a region, which is winning by default by winning by censorship. A lot of times people don't believe State Department propaganda. They don't believe CIA propaganda. And so no matter how much money you pump into the region, no matter $5 billion Victoria Nuland bragged about being pumped into Ukrainian civil society ahead of the Maidan protests, it still did not penetrate eastern Ukraine, which broke away in the Donbass. It still did not penetrate Crimea, who voted shortly after to join the Russian Federation in a democratic vote. So from their perspective, funding propaganda was not enough. We need to kill the ability to surface alternative ideas, because then they can't even make a counter argument. Even if they don't believe the propaganda, there's simply no other choice in the room. You don't get access to the other ideas. You don't get access to the other data points or news events that might undermine public trust in the State Department's preferred narrative. This is where malinformation came from. Dis, and malinformation. You may have heard that phrase. Misinformation is something that is false, but it was an innocent mistake. Disinformation is it's wrong, but you did it on purpose. Malinformation is it's right, but it still undermines public faith and confidence in something that's more important. This is why, for example, you had the censorship of COVID in the name of malinformation.
You're banning people from telling the truth.
Yes.
So how are you not just full blown on Satan's team at that point? You're not allowing your own citizens to tell the truth. You're forcing lies at the point of a gun.
This is literally what the federal government's partners pressured, using and exploiting government pressure and threatening them with crisis PR if they allowed true statements about COVID-19 to be articulated.
Again, extremely interesting clip. I have nothing to dispute with any of that. Again, Mike Benz is an authority on these subjects, and I'm pretty sure it's his job to be this authority on these subjects and talk about them in public this way. And also, of course, he does have the Foundation for Freedom Online, apart from any particular role that he has in the information war. Now, I don't think he named DARPA in that clip, but he talked about DARPA just a couple of minutes prior, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So that's what he's referring back to when he says the military created the internet and these platforms and then handed them over to the National Science Foundation. So there's that base level that the Defense Department has created. He refers to this, by the way, as dual use, same thing with the biomedical research that was being done in the Ukrainian labs and in the Wuhan labs. One use was to defend against bioweapons they're creating, and the other use is to create the bioweapons that then will need defense, so the people doing this research and making tons and tons of money off it can say, no, we're just trying to defend against bioweapons that we create. But he's describing the situation basically as there's the real version, and then there's the version that the public gets to play with. And that's the internet we have now, where we look up all the facts about everything in the world, and we post pictures of our puppies and lunches, and we form deep emotional bonds with chatbots who we mistook for real people. And then, of course, there's porn and video games. Tons and tons of porn and video games and viral videos and sports news and pictures of celebrities in their special outfits. Now, he also talks about turning the knobs of the propaganda up, something we've talked about many times, and turning up the censorship as well. I've probably mentioned the dead internet theory on here before. It's the idea that the internet is much smaller seeming than it used to be. It's much less useful. You're constantly redirected to a handful of the same places over and over and over again. It's really difficult to find good, usable information, and that tons of the content on the internet is actually created by bots and AIs, not actual humans. What we see on the internet is often just the computer regenerating itself in new ways, and in response, we just keep staring at the screens. He says, the strategy here is twofold, turning up the knobs of the blob's propaganda channels and turning down the knobs of anyone who opposes that. Because you can win in three ways. You win in a fair fight, you can win by super saturating your own media voice, or you can win by default because the opposition political party, the opposition political movement is not allowed. And that's why after 2016, the State Department set up censorship programs in 140 countries. But don't worry, we can get out of it by pressing buttons on an iPad attached to a black box down at the local elementary school cafeteria. And I want to be clear because I keep hammering that. This is not me blackpilling. As I just said about 10 minutes ago, in many ways, this war has already been won on a big picture level. The goal should be to understand what happened and then attempt to hold society together while people adjust to the jarring effects of realizing that reality was not what they thought it was. Now, I imagine that some of my listeners have been awake for far longer than I have, but I know the feeling, and I'm guessing almost everyone listening to this knows the feeling. Some of you might be the most based people on earth since birth. I was not one of those people. Now we're going to skip ahead a bit. Tucker Carlson, at one point in the podcast, talks about how his father used to run Voice of America. Voice of America is an international network that pumps U.S. propaganda into foreign countries. And it used to be run by Tucker Carlson's father, who was the director of the U.S. Information Agency and the USIA Documentary Film Service. You can hear Tucker kind of at least representing that he's wrestling with that fact, that he always thought it was a good thing that America was exporting its ideas to the world, and now maybe he's not so sure because it just turns out that we were taking over all of those countries. And his dad was in charge of the propaganda organization. VOA used to be, at least legally and ostensibly, forbidden from broadcasting to the American people, but that all went away with the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act. Now they can propagandize us as much as they want. Now, similar to Voice of America was Radio Free Europe, same sort of thing, pumping regime propaganda into countries all around the world. Tucker's going to mention them here.
Radio Free Europe is disgusting. Let me just say, having grown up around it, I'm just shocked by what it's become. It's disgusting, and they should be ashamed of themselves.
Well, Radio Free Europe was lauding, Telegram from 2014 to 2020. What they argue is that something may have changed beginning in 2021 with a new round of funding. I believe a debt round, a large dollar figure debt round that was raised, and they argue that there may have been Russian investors in that, and so there may have been some payoff. And so because of that, Russia only stopped, because for 2 years they were pursuing banning Telegram from Russia, but then they stopped it. And at the time, that was considered a major free speech victory by the United States and by the State Department. They applauded the NGO pressure on Russia and the threat of sanctions on Russia for if they went ahead and banned Telegram. But the fact that they relented and then ubiquitously used Telegram, actually, Telegram usage in Russia massively surged after the ban. There's only about 10% of Russians who used it before the ban, and now it's over 50%. And so they argue between the funding, between the fact that they're losing in all these places where they use Telegram now, and that Russia may be keen to it, and the fact that the attempted ban was dropped and then a massive surge in usage afterwards, can only mean that Russia began to be pro-Telegram because of a secret deal between them.
So, in other words, Ukraine is losing a land war against a country with 100 million more people because Pavel Durov has some secret arrangement with Putin. Yes. I mean, this is the kind of fantastical, childish thinking that makes empires fall, actually. I mean, the total inability to deal with reality, to assess your own shortcomings, to be honest about anything as it pertains to yourself, to be honest about yourself and how much you suck. Those are fatal weaknesses in people and in countries. And I grieve to see the U.S. government fall into that kind of self-indulgent fantasy.
Right. But think about the amazing windfall that just befell the CIA. They've had no leverage against Pavel this entire time, and yet the entire Russian military architecture is built on Telegram. All high-level Russian military and political officials, the internal workings of Russian statecraft and deliberations all happen on Telegram. And there's been no window into that because of Pavel's belief in free speech. So now, if Pavel cracks under interrogation, if he cracks under pressure, suddenly all communications of all Russian citizens and all Russian military officials and all Russian diplomats that were taking place on Telegram for the past 5 years are now in the hands of the CIA. So this is
why don't we just torture him to death? I mean, like, why not just drop the pretense and just we're North Korea now, with slightly better infrastructure, slightly, and stop pretending, because that's what this is. They're torturing a man, and in the process, stripping us of our God-given speech rights and our right to privacy that they're always crowing about, but only when it pertains to abortion. I mean, this is so immoral, what we're participating in. Does even occur to all the creeps on the internet, the Atlantic Council, Alexander Vindman, all the people who think this is great, does it occur to them that like they're no better than North Korea in this situation?
Now, there's plenty we could focus on in that clip, but I think one of the most amazing things is the idea that it is unusual from the CIA's perspective not to be able to capture all of the communications that any of their adversaries might make online. We have talked many times before about how it seems like regime elements have been cut off from the great data source up in the cloud. We've talked about how they never seem to be ahead of events. They don't seem to be in any better position than the mainstream media. And of course, they're the same thing. But the same also holds true for the illegitimate Biden administration, because they are being run by that same international intel community that no longer has the access to information they used to have. And if you don't understand how it is that a one world global government who seems to have control of everything could lose that control and watch the whole thing collapse and crash down, as Mike Benz said, like the financial buildings do at the end of Fight Club, it's because they've lost their access to much of the information they used to have access to, the information they would use to guide themselves. That's why they're constantly freaking out and constantly further exposing themselves. They are desperately flailing in an information war they are losing. That's not something they're going to be able to reverse if the TV tells you that cackling Comrade Kamala won on November 5th. But of course, that doesn't mean that everything is finished. There's still plenty to be done in people's individual understanding of the world, in their relationships, in their communities, reforming a new government in this country. Well, all of that is why this podcast is called The Endgame. That's legitimately why. The Endgame is all the moves playing out once the victory has been decided, or when there are only a few moves left to make. Which direction are things going? Are they going toward the regime and their goal of creating that one world international liberal rules-based order? No, not at all. It's going in the direction of the multipolar world order. We can watch it emerge. We get more signals every day. We just have to accept what we're seeing and stop waiting for a permission structure to be granted to us by our betters, by the authoritative sources, before we're willing to actively, mentally move into that world and live there. Here's Benz laying out the reasons why Durov was actually detained, assuming it's not all just for story effect. And I certainly don't think that can be assumed.
Well, actually, there's a great point along this, which gets right to the France story and this intersection between U.S. and French interests. U.S. and French shared military intelligence and diplomatic and economic interests in arresting Pavel and finally getting the leverage they've craved for so long to be able to both control Telegram's content moderation practice, to ban all Russian propaganda channels, which are infecting the minds of everyone from Ukraine to Belarus to sub-Saharan Africa, but also the ability to get this back-end access to read every Russian text message effectively. There's a great example of this in terms of blowback on Americans. So we've talked about this group, the Atlantic Council, which bills itself as NATO's think tank. It is, again, a lot of people don't even know 7 CIA directors are still alive, let alone all clustered together on the board of directors of a NATO think tank. But it gets annual funding from the Pentagon, the State Department, and CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy, as well as USAID. There are 11 different federal government agencies who all provide federal government funding every single year to what is effectively the civilian influence arm of NATO. Now, in March 2018, the Atlantic Council published a set of white papers called Democratic Defense Against Disinformation. And in the March 2018 version of it, the cover photo, again, this is funded by the United States Pentagon, United States State Department, and United States Intelligence Service conduits. The front page of this memo called Democratic Defense Against Disinformation, which called for this whole of society playbook about how the government could organize civil society censorship from the civil society side, censorship from the private sector side, censorship, advocacy in media organizations. The cover of the memo was a giant network map, a network narrative map of the French election, because at the time there was WikiLeaks had published something called the Macron leaks, which were these sensitive, politically embarrassing emails involving Macron when he was neck and neck in the race against Marine Le Pen in 2018. And the front page of it, had in red all these narrative network maps of French citizens and Russians. But there were two big green network nodes that were highlighted at the front of the memo. And one of them was a big network node saying WikiLeaks. The other one was a big network node saying Jack Posobiec. Just so you understand what's going on here. WikiLeaks had published these Macron leaks, and Jack Posobiec at the time was this large, U.S.-based, U.S. citizen social media influencer who was one of the first and most aggressive to popularize the distribution of these Macron leaks on social media. And that was considered an attack on democracy by effectively the Pentagon, the State Department, the CIA, NATO. They were not targeting Russians. They were not targeting French. They were targeting a U.S. citizen for amplifying now publicly available documents that might undermine political support for NATO's preferred political puppet in France.
By telling the truth.
By publishing true documents.
Yeah, it was that's exactly right. So what I'm saying is there was no allegation. It wasn't like the Hunter Biden laptop in the first weeks where this isn't real. No one contested the fact these were real. These were real. But you just weren't allowed to see them because you can't know the truth because it might make you harder to control.
Well, this is the issue is this is a U.S. citizen. This is a U.S. funded institution, gets millions of dollars every year. It has 7 CIA directors on its board. The Army funds it. The Navy funds it. The Air Force funds it. USAID funds it, the State Department. And in the crosshairs of the cover page of the memo is a U.S. citizen for doing what? That wasn't even a U.S. event. It was an American citizen publishing about a election in a galaxy far, far away. How much is it going to take? If we colonize Mars and there's an election on Mars, can the Central Intelligence Agency organize the censorship of an American citizen because the CIA's preferred puppet for the electoral race on Mars, is being undermined because of a social media post from someone living in rural Montana? There's no end to this.
But at least they let us elect our own leaders. I mean, right? Again, not blackpilling. Just trying to make sure we're all very realistic about the society we actually live in. And one more clip from Benz, and then we'll wrap this thing up.
On the tactical side, it's, who are you going to attack, how, when? The logistics is how do you get the supplies there? How do you get the funding for it? And the political is, do you have political support at home to be able to fund the logistics, to be able to do these particular tactics? If the war is not popular at home, you don't get the funding for all the logistics that you need. You don't get approval for certain tactics that would be deemed human rights violations or war crimes. And so you can, the U.S. military establishment believes that we lost Vietnam. This is famously called, Vietnam syndrome, because we lost in the political domain. This is why the U.S. State Department and the CIA fund anti-war movements domestically within countries that we go to war with. We pump up the anti-war voices in the country, the anti-war parliamentarians who might be in control of that country's budget in order to undermine their own ability to capacity build the war. And this is what's happened here. This was this George H.W. Bush quote, by God, we kicked Vietnam syndrome, when he brought CNN, onto military airplanes to propagandize how great the war was. And this is why the media has been so intensely onboarded in all Pentagon operations, since Vietnam.
And yet they're still very unpopular. They're extremely unpopular. The Iraq War, looking backward, whatever the hell we tried to do in Syria, whatever we did in Libya, the 20 years in Afghanistan, those are all seen as failures by a huge percentage of the American population, despite the relentless propaganda. So that should really matter. If the majority of the public is against something, we shouldn't do it because we're supposed to be in charge of the government.
Well, this is where I come back to doctrine. when you are a part of this apparatus, you are now taught that what democracy means is the institutions, the democratic institutions, the government institutions, the NGO institutions, the media institutions, and any private sector company who signs on board.
It's a really deep and important insight. You said that about what, a year ago? You first said that? I heard you say it about a year ago, and it changed my thinking completely.
But this is also because I'm hearing you react to how evil it all is.
Yeah,
multiple times. No. Wait,
can't
actually
control myself.
No, I'm glad you did, because I think this is a useful point for the American public to understand, which is that when you're in this thing, it doesn't look like it does from the outside, because the language of censor speak is a very unique one. In the same way that Marxism, sort of rose to some level of cultural mainstream because of a decade of incubation in universities, developing this esoteric jargon, this sort of Lego tower of abstractions and concepts that when it was finally rolled out to the public could have a sort of set of frameworks to rationalize and support it. There is a thick lexicon of censor speak that totally takes the human element out of it. So when you are a part of this censorship apparatus, you don't really feel like you are censoring people. I'll give you an example. They don't refer to people who they censor as citizens or people. They refer to them as cyber threat actors. Okay, yeah. So when you are censoring,
when they kill them, they don't say they kill them; they liquidate them.
Right. Yes, or neutralize. Yeah. When you they don't refer to your tweets or your Facebook posts or your YouTube video. They call those incidents. So
because your opinions are a crime,
right? When you capacity build with tens of millions of dollars, U.S. funded censorship mercenary firms, you are not funding censorship. You are building digital resilience. You are engaging in a media literacy campaign.
And they tangent into a conversation about the gender makeup of these organizations, mostly irrelevant, skipping that, but continuing.
As I get back to, for example, the National Science Foundation is who's funding all the universities. The Pentagon is funding, countless censorship mercenary firms. USAID, again, has these entire programs with thousands of these, censorship promoting media organizations, censorship, post flagging, disinformation experts. And so you enter this kind of cloistered world with its own language. And there's also a sort of moral justification, because these people have unbelievable amounts of power, over a kind of godlike feeling over the political ebbs and flows of every country on earth. And yet, they don't necessarily make very much to reflect what they do. I mean, think about the power that the director of the Central Intelligence Agency has, and yet makes less than Tony Fauci, makes less than a 6-year, associate, junior, mid-level associate at a New York law firm. And yet this person determines, the rise and fall of, virtually every country on earth, or at least has significant influence over it. So the money networks are very important, because this has become a boon field. I call it the censorship industry, because that's the most useful way to understand what the glue that keeps everything together. It is a censorship industrial complex, but it is the industry that keeps all the cogs in the wheel going. The private sectors make bank because they do government favors.
They branch off into a conversation about Microsoft, so we'll skip that. Come back here.
Solidarity Center. So this is basically the CIA intermediary, CIA back channeling with unions, because unions play a major role in the Renta riots. In Belarus, for example, this is how you get workers without a lot to lose, who, a little bit of money goes a long way. These are the people who are in control of how the trains work. Part of this playbook for destabilizing a country is you shut down all the instruments the government could use. So you shut down the railroads, you block the highways, the hospital, workers all walk out. the teachers from the teachers unions all walk out. And so the CIA has to have a back channel to that. So that's the Solidarity Center, among other linkages there. But the fourth of the core four is called the Center for International Private Enterprise. And this is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce commercial interests in the region that the CIA is orchestrating a regime change operation in, or is putting influence on the existing government. And so this is it was a major event in the Republican Party when the U.S. Chamber of Commerce turned against Trump. The only parity that the Republican Party had against Democrats for the past 100 years has been the fact that while Democrats had the media, Hollywood, music and culture, unions, and to some extent finance, Republicans had the war industry, the energy industry, and the Chamber of Commerce, because these Chamber of Commerce companies preferred republicanism for its free market, free enterprise, and low tax structure. The problem is Trump sort of, stepped on a rattlesnake with this idea of making America first and American nationalism, to the extent that it cut back on American interventionism, American, constant democracy promotion abroad. He was the first president in 40 years not to, declare a new war effectively. So you had all these Chamber of Commerce companies the lion's share of the revenue is dependent on foreign markets, or whose supply chains are sourced in foreign countries. And they need a big bad CIA. They need a big bad State Department. They need a big bad USAID and a big bad Pentagon if necessary. And so Trumpism became a sort of threat to the bottom line of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And so I come back to this because the commercial interests here are sort of driving what's happening at the intelligence and military and diplomatic policy level, if that makes sense.
They tangent again. Benz gives Ukraine as an example of what he's talking about. And again, by all means, go ahead and listen to this interview if you want to catch all of that. But I want to return right here.
So again, you have this relationship between the commercial. So it's not just that we have a rogue State Department. We have a revolving door between big government and big corporations. And the idea of putting America first, in a world where those corporations are primarily multinational, means that nationalism is a threat to multinational corporate interests. And so multinational corporate interests will sponsor the State Department activity and use the battering ram of the CIA, the State Department, the Pentagon, and NATO to achieve those corporate interests. So we have a much bigger problem here, which is why I call for reform, because our whole financial ecosystem is actually bent on this.
And that's just the nature of globalization. I mean, that was always going to happen if you thought it through why would, Brexit be seen as a threat to U.S. interests?
Mike Benz has essentially broken down the way the system operates, the way the global regime operates. They take over countries. This is what they do. The reason we can't tell that it's happened here is because we're told we're the most powerful and patriotic country of all time. It could never actually happen here because no one could ever defeat us militarily. And again, I love and appreciate American mythology. I hope we can return to a society that aligns with and lives up to what was described. But the reason is because we have the global regime's global police force, and our currency is the global reserve currency. And wait a second, those are the tools they use to control other nations: the American currency, the American military, and the American government. It's not a legitimate government working on behalf of the American people. Our government is a collection of figureheads trying to sell the American people the idea that the global regime's agenda for them is not only a good thing, it's the best thing. In fact, it's the only thing you could ever possibly want. And their staffs are essentially mid-level managers who conduct the business of the American corporate interest this global occupying regime went ahead and set up. When did they set it up? Well, it's been here the whole time. That's what the anti-federalists were afraid of. But if everyone can understand this and people decide to stand up, then they won't be here much longer. But that's going to require free speech. which Americans are then going to have to use to defend a Russian man whose product is the go-to communications platform for the Russian military. Think about how many inversions we must have gone through to wind up in a place we discover that's the real truth. Hopefully, the Pavel Durov narrative will wake up the normies. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com, and for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon, down on the range.